Donald Trump is turning the US government into the largest private equity organization in the world, with you holding on to the risk and the bag. So, Trump recently announced that he is taking a 10% stake. The US government is taking a 10% stake in Intel. So, what does that mean? I went on MSNBC to explain.
What does this actually and practically mean that the United States government now owns a 10% share in a chip manufacturing company?
It means that Donald Trump is essentially turning the United States government to the largest private equity firm in the world. And it's the taxpayers who are funding his bets, right? And so if you believe Donald Trump's a good investor, maybe, but I think the majority of Americans do not, and they should all be alarmed by this. Look, this has happened in temporary versions in the past, under Obama, under Bush, but these were during crises, right? The banks needed a bailout.
Right.
The auto industry needed a bailout. There was temporary equity that was immediately returned, and it was never understood that it would be a long-term thing. Not only has Donald Trump done this and not given any specificity on window, but he has also alluded to doing this more and more. So it's not only the bullying, which I think is a very apt thing. Hey, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to hostile take over your company. But what about other American companies like Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm, these competitors? Is he going to start making policy that's only going to benefit Intel? They have a financial incentive. Some would argue a fiduciary duty to do that. And what does that mean for our government and fairness? Okay, so what does 10% stake actually means? It essentially means that the US government now owns 10% of Intel, which hopefully in Donald Trump's mind means that as the value of Intel goes up, the stake that the United States government continues to go up, and there may be a point in which they could sell that equity stake for more, helping Americans. But here is the reality. The reality is the US government exists to be a referee and not to be a player on the field in terms of the private markets like this. There is never an example in modern history of the US government intervening in the long term and taking equity stakes. As a matter of fact, if you look at some of the reaction, even from the right, has been pretty vocal. For example, Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Foundation, said, "Are you effing kidding me? We are past 1984 into Animal Farm territory," referring to the George Orwell satirical novel. Did anyone vote for this? Anyone? Daniel DiMartino, a fellow of the far-right center, a fellow at the right of center Manhattan Institute, predicted that if this happens, the U.S. would see more cronyism because that will result in companies will underperform because they know they will be bailed out and taxpayers will lose billions. You can't just be against socialism. The left does it. Conservative talk show Eric Erickson said of the Intel agreement, if you're not against socialism, guess what? You're going to get socialism. So if you support socialism, apparently Donald Trump is your guy. So let me explain this. People ask, well, what about the banks and the auto bailouts? Those were special circumstances in which the United States took equity in some of these companies and then exited very, very quickly. So the United States does not own Goldman Sachs, GM, et cetera, any equity in the way that it had to in that, well, some would argue that they had to in that period. Okay. So that's very different from what Donald Trump is doing, which is taking a long-term stake in a company. And they have indicated that they may do that again and again. Why is this a concern? So, for example, when you work in the White House, you create policy that in theory is supposed to help people and businesses do better. When you own Intel, for example, and there's a policy that might help AMD, Nvidia, Qualcomm, their competitors, well, if you own 10% of Intel, that makes you want to create policy that would only help your investment and not others, which hurts Americans who are working in those companies that are trying to have an ecosystem to thrive. It sets up all kinds of incentives that are negative. On top of all of that, when Donald Trump is investing in Intel on the inside, all of a sudden now there are all these external factors, people investing because they see the investment, people see it as a next step for Trump's leadership, and so they may buy more of his crypto. There are all kinds of reasons why this is incredibly concerning. And probably most concerning is that if somehow something bad were to happen to Intel, there's going to be two choices, right? Either that 10% stake that you all paid for will be lower and your money will be hurt, or Donald Trump will do something to bail out just Intel to save that,
which would require more money from the US government, which would hurt other competitors in the industry, and ultimately more jobs and more money for people and harm the chance for more jobs and more money for people overall in the United States. I can't imagine that the only part of this is philanthropic generosity by Donald Trump. This is yet another example of Donald Trump asserting control. He bullied the Intel CEO and called that person names before they accepted this 10% stake. This is Donald Trump loving the control of the private and taking control of private markets like this. I am sure that he will threaten other companies and say, well, if you don't do XYZ, I'm going to try to take control of your company too. This is just yet another step in Donald Trump totally essentially eating the way of life of the United States, of the way governments proceed, and remaking government in his own image that sets us up and sets all of us up for more risk and more harm. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and tell us who else you would like to see sworn in. And let us know in the comments what other topics you'd like us to cover. Let's go.